Crimson Texas Courage. Isabel Bell Carter had spent her life making safe choices, never betting more than she could afford to lose. But when Cass Rhodes slid a deck of cards toward her, his smirk slow and knowing, she knew she was in trouble. He leaned in, fingers brushing against hers. "You got two choices, sugar," he murmured. "Fold, or play the hand you've been dealt with me." Chapter 1. The Deck of Shadows and Doubt. The air in the Lucky Star saloon hung thick with the scent of stale beer, cheap tobacco, and the lingering ghost of desperation. Isabel Carter, Belle to those who knew her well enough, and few did these days, sat rigid in her worn, velvet-backed chair, the polished wood of the table digging into her forearms. Her gaze was fixed on the deck of cards, its edges softened with age, lying innocently between her and the man across from her. Cass Rhodes. The name itself felt like a drawl, slow and dangerous, much like the man himself. He hadn't always been Cass Rhodes. Or, at least, that's what the whispers around Dust Devil Gulch suggested. He'd ridden into town 3 months prior, a shadow against the setting sun, his past as dusty and unreadable as the trails he'd undoubtedly crossed. He'd bought the Lucky Star, a failing establishment on the edge of town, and with a few shrewd moves, a charming smile, and an unnerving ability to read people, he'd turned it into the place to be. Or, more accurately, the place to lose yourself. Belle had avoided it, and him, with the practiced ease of a woman who knew the sting of loss all too well. Her life had been a carefully constructed edifice of routine and responsibility. The small, respectable boarding house she ran, inherited from her late husband, Thomas, was her sanctuary, her fortress against the unpredictable winds of fate. Thomas, bless his steady soul, had been a good man. Predictable. Safe. He'd provided a life of quiet comfort, a stark contrast to the tumultuous years before she'd met him. Years she preferred to keep buried beneath the floorboards of her memory. But tonight, the carefully stacked cards of her life had been dealt a blow she hadn't anticipated. Her younger brother, Samuel, bright and impulsive, with a smile that could charm the birds from the trees, had fallen prey to the lure of the Lucky Star and to Cass Rhodes's particular brand of temptation. He'd accumulated a debt, a significant one, and Cass, in his infinite, infuriating generosity, had offered Belle a way out. A game. "You got two choices, sugar," he'd murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the saloon. His fingers, long and calloused, had brushed against hers as he slid the deck across the table, the contact sending an unwelcome shiver up her spine. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Something dangerous. "Fold, or play the hand you've been dealt with me." The smirk that played on his lips was slow and knowing, the kind that promised trouble and delivered it with a wink. His eyes, the color of aged whiskey, held a glint of something that could have been amusement, or perhaps something far more predatory. He was a handsome man, there was no denying it. Ruggedly so, with a face that seemed carved from the very landscape surrounding Dust Devil Gulch, all sharp angles and sun-weathered plains. His dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples, fell just past his collar, framing a jawline that could cut glass. He wore a simple, worn denim shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, hinting at a life lived on the edge, a life far removed from Belle's quiet existence. Belle swallowed, the lump in her throat feeling as large as the gold nugget Samuel had foolishly wagered and lost last week. Folding meant Samuel would be at the mercy of Cass Rhodes. And while the man hadn't shown any overt signs of cruelty, there was an underlying current of something that made Belle deeply uneasy. He was a gambler, a businessman, and a man who clearly enjoyed playing with people's lives as much as he enjoyed playing cards. Playing meant risking everything. Not just the debt, but something far more precious, her carefully constructed peace. Her control. Her heart, perhaps, which had remained stubbornly dormant for so long. She looked at her hands, the skin roughened by years of work, the faint lines around her eyes a testament to the battles she'd fought and won, mostly against herself. She was 48, Not old, but not young either. The bloom of youth had faded, replaced by a quiet strength, a resilience born of hardship. She'd buried a husband, raised a younger brother, and built a life for herself in a town that chewed up and spat out the weak.
She was not weak.
But Cass Rhodes, he was a different kind of challenge. He was a storm brewing on the horizon, and Belle knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that stepping into his game would mean stepping into the heart of that storm. She met his gaze, her own eyes, a clear, steady blue, unwavering. "What are the stakes?" she asked, her voice surprisingly calm, even to her own ears. He leaned back, a flicker of something that might have been respect crossing his features. "If you win," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "Samuel's debt is cleared." He walks away. "You both do. And if I lose?" Belle pressed, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Cass's smile widened, a flash of white teeth against the shadowed backdrop of the saloon. "If you lose," he said, his voice laced with a dangerous sweetness, "the debt is still cleared. But you become my obligation. For 1 year. You work for me here at the Lucky Star." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the clinking of glasses, the muffled laughter from the other patrons, and the frantic beat of Belle's own heart. Work for him. Be beholden to him. For a year. The thought sent a wave of nausea through her. It wasn't the work itself. Belle was no stranger to hard labor. It was the him part. The proximity. The constant reminder of her failure. The undeniable pull she felt towards him, a pull she desperately wanted to ignore. She looked around the saloon, taking in the faces of the men and women lost in their own games of chance, their hopes and dreams reflected in the flickering lamplight. She saw desperation, greed, and a fleeting glimmer of hope that was quickly extinguished by the harsh reality of the odds. She saw herself, reflected in their eyes, a woman on the precipice of a decision that could change everything. Belle took a deep breath, the scent of the saloon suddenly overwhelming, a suffocating reminder of the choice she had to make. She thought of Samuel, his youthful face clouded with worry, his future hanging in the balance. She thought of Thomas, his gentle smile, his unwavering belief in her. She thought of the life she had built, the quiet dignity she had salvaged from the wreckage of her past. And then, she thought of Cass Rhodes, his eyes burning into hers, his presence a challenge, a threat, and a strangely compelling invitation all rolled into one. Her hand, seemingly of its own accord, reached out and touched the deck of cards. The worn pasteboard felt cool beneath her fingertips, a tangible representation of the gamble she was about to take. "Deal the cards, Mr. Rhodes," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering.
"I'll play."
The corner of his lip tilted in a slow, devastating smile. He began to shuffle. Each flick of his wrist seemed to whisper her name, and with a cut, her future, one way or another, was sealed. Chapter 2. A handful of regret and resilience. The cards whispered secrets as they flew from Cass's hands, landing face down on the worn felt of the table. Belle watched them, her mind a whirlwind of calculations and anxieties. She wasn't a gambler, not in the traditional sense. But life, she'd learned, was the ultimate gamble, and she'd played her hand cautiously, always holding back, always protecting herself from the potential for loss. Tonight, however, caution was a luxury she couldn't afford. Cass dealt 5 cards to each of them, his movements fluid and practiced, his eyes never leaving hers. The whiskey-colored depths held a mixture of amusement and something else, something that made Belle's skin prickle with a strange awareness. It wasn't quite challenge, not anymore. It was anticipation. Belle picked up her cards, her fingers fumbling slightly. She fanned them out, her heart sinking as she surveyed her hand. It was mediocre. A scattering of low-value cards, a single queen, and nothing that suggested a winning combination. She glanced at Cass, trying to read his expression, but his face was an impassive mask, revealing nothing. He was a master of disguise, she realized, a skill honed over years of living on the edge, of hiding his true self from the world. You going to stare at them all night, sugar, or are you going to play? Cass drawled, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down Belle's spine. She forced herself to meet his gaze. Her own eyes narrowed. I'm thinking, she retorted, her voice sharper than she intended. Thinking won't win you this game, Belle, he said softly, his use of her name sending another unwelcome jolt through her. Instinct will. Trusting your gut. Knowing when to hold. And when to fold. His words echoed the advice Thomas had often given her, advice she'd always followed. But Thomas's world had been one of gentle predictability, of carefully measured risks. Cass Rhodes's world was a different beast altogether. It was a world of shadows and whispers, of hidden dangers and unpredictable outcomes. Belle drew a card from the remaining deck, her heart pounding in her chest. A 7. Useless. She discarded a 3, her mind racing. She needed a miracle.
She needed something.
She glanced around the saloon, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the other patrons. They were a motley crew, a collection of drifters, dreamers, and desperados, all drawn to the lucky star like moths to a flame. She saw the flicker of hope in their eyes, the desperation in their clenched jaws, the resignation in their slumped shoulders. She saw the ghosts of their pasts, their regrets, their lost loves, their broken dreams. And then she saw him, a man standing in the shadows near the bar, his back to her, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the dim light. He was tall and lean, his dark hair falling to his collar, a worn leather jacket hugging his frame. There was something familiar about him, something that tugged at the edges of Belle's memory. She frowned, trying to place him. She'd seen him around town. She was sure of it. He was a stranger, like Cass, but there was something different about him. He didn't seem to belong here, in this den of iniquity. He seemed out of place.
Lost.
Belle's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, her intuition screaming at her. There was something about this man, something important. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it in her bones, a deep, visceral connection that defied logic. She shook her head, dismissing the feeling as foolishness. She was letting her nerves get the better of her. She needed to focus on the game, on saving Samuel, on protecting herself. Your turn, Belle, Cass said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. Belle looked back at her cards, her mind still racing. She had nothing. Nothing but a queen and a handful of regrets. But she also had resilience. She'd learned to survive, to adapt, to find strength in the face of adversity. She'd learned to play the hand she was dealt, even when the odds were stacked against her. She met Cass's gaze, her own eyes hardening with determination. I'll raise, she said, her voice steady. Cass's eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Bold move, sugar, he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. What are you betting? Belle hesitated for a moment, her mind calculating the risk. She had a small amount of savings, money she'd carefully squirreled away over the years. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. It was her safety net, her security. But Samuel's future was worth more than any amount of money. I'll bet $50, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Cass whistled softly. That's a hefty sum, Belle. You sure about this? Belle nodded, her jaw clenched. I'm sure. Cass leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying her intently. All right then, he said, his voice low and smooth. I'll see your 50 and raise you another 50. Belle's heart skipped a beat. $100. It was more than she had. She was bluffing, playing a hand she couldn't win. But she couldn't back down now. She had to see this through, to the bitter end. I'll call, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Cass smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a chill down Belle's spine. Show me what you've got, sugar, he said softly. Belle laid her cards on the table, her hand trembling. A queen, a 7, a 9, a 4, and a 2. Nothing. Cass's smile widened. He laid his cards down one by one, his movements slow and deliberate. A pair of jacks, a 10, an 8, and a 6. A pair. He'd won. Belle closed her eyes, a wave of despair washing over her. She'd lost. She'd gambled everything, and she'd lost. She was now indebted to Cass Rhodes, a man she barely knew, a man who held her future in his hands. A heavy hand settled on the small of her back, a thumb tracing small, soothing circles. She startled, nearly jumping out of her chair before she turned and met the concerned gaze of the stranger from the bar. "Are you all right, ma'am?" His voice, low and gentle, somehow cut through the fog of despair that had settled. She swallowed and forced a stiff nod, not trusting her voice. He smelled of leather and fresh air, a stark contrast to the smoky interior of the saloon. "He's a complicated man," the stranger continued, his eyes, a startling shade of green, flicking to Cass and then back to her. "Be careful." And with that cryptic warning, he was gone, melting back into the crowd before Belle could even form a question. The lingering warmth of his touch, however, was enough to send her spiraling back into a maelstrom of uncertainty. What did he mean? Chapter 3. The Whispers of the Frontier Wind. The morning sun, a harsh, unforgiving glare, sliced through the dusty window panes of Belle's boarding house, illuminating the worn furniture and the faded floral wallpaper. Belle sat at the small, round table in the kitchen, a cup of lukewarm coffee untouched before her. Her head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache that mirrored the turmoil in her heart. She hadn't slept. The events of the previous night replayed themselves in her mind. Relentless loop of bad decisions and crushing defeat. The image of Cass Rhodes's triumphant smile, the feel of the stranger's hand on her back, the cryptic warning he'd whispered, it all swirled together in a chaotic mess that left her feeling drained and disoriented. She'd told Samuel, of course. He'd been waiting up for her, his face pale and drawn with worry. The news of her loss had hit him hard, his youthful exuberance replaced by a crushing sense of guilt. He'd offered to run, to disappear, to take the burden of his debt upon himself. But Belle had refused. She wouldn't let him sacrifice his future for her mistake. She would face Cass Rhodes, she would fulfill her obligation, and she would somehow, someway, find a way to survive. The thought of working at the Lucky Star, of being under Cass's constant scrutiny, sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. She imagined the smoky atmosphere, the leering glances of the patrons, the constant reminder of her failure. It was a far cry from the quiet respectability of her boarding house, from the predictable routine that had been her solace for so long. But she had no choice. She'd made a bargain, a foolish, desperate bargain, and she would honor it. She was a Carter, and Carters, despite their flaws, were known for their resilience, their stubborn refusal to be broken by adversity. A knock on the front door startled her. She rose, smoothing down her wrinkled dress, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and defiance. She opened the door to find Cass Rhodes standing on her porch, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the wooden floorboards. He was dressed much as he had been the previous night, in a worn denim shirt and trousers, a leather vest accentuating his broad shoulders. But in the harsh light of day, she could see the lines of weariness etched around his eyes, the faint stubble that shadowed his jaw, the hint of vulnerability that he'd so carefully concealed in the smoky darkness of the saloon. "Morning, Belle," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very planks of the porch. He held a small, leather-bound book in his hand. "Thought I'd come by and discuss the terms of our agreement." Belle stepped aside, inviting him in. She gestured towards the kitchen table, her movements stiff and formal. "Please sit down, Mr. Rhodes." He followed her into the kitchen, his gaze sweeping over the room, taking in the simple furnishings, the worn curtains, the faint scent of lavender that clung to the air. He sat down at the table, placing the book before him. "I've drawn up a contract of sorts," he said, opening the book and sliding it across the table towards her. "It outlines your duties, your hours, your compensation." Belle picked up the book, her fingers trembling slightly. She scanned the neatly written pages, her heart sinking with each word. The terms were harsh. Long hours, demanding work, and a paltry wage that barely covered the cost of her living expenses. It was clear that Cass Rhodes intended to make her pay for her loss, not just in labor, but in humiliation. She looked up at him, her eyes narrowed. "This is unreasonable, Mr. Rhodes," she said, her voice tight with anger. "You're taking advantage of the situation." Cass leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying her intently. "I'm simply enforcing the terms of our agreement, Belle," he said softly. "You lost. You owe me a year of your service. This is how it works." "It doesn't have to be this way," Belle retorted, her voice rising. "You could show some compassion. Some decency." Cass's expression hardened. "Decency doesn't pay the bills, Belle," he said, his voice laced with a hint of bitterness. "And compassion is a luxury I can't afford." He stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "You start tomorrow, Belle," he said, his voice firm. 6 o'clock sharp. Don't be late." He turned to leave, his back to her. Belle watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of anger, resentment, and something else. Something she couldn't quite define. As he reached the door, he paused, his hand on the doorknob. He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers. "And Belle," he said, his voice low and soft, "don't think for a moment that you can outsmart me. I always collect my debts." He left, the door closing behind him with a resounding click. Belle stood there, frozen, his words echoing in her ears. She was trapped. Trapped in a game she couldn't win, a game orchestrated by a man who seemed to hold all the cards. But as she stood there, in the quiet solitude of her kitchen, a flicker of defiance ignited within her. She might be trapped, but she wasn't broken. She would survive this. She would endure. And she would, somehow, find a way to turn the tables on Cass Rhodes. She would find his weakness, his vulnerability, the chink in his armor. And she would use it to her advantage. She looked out the window, at the vast expanse of the desert stretching out before her, the wind whipping through the dry grasses, carrying the whispers of the frontier. The wind seemed to speak to her, to urge her on, to remind her of the strength that lay dormant within her, the strength of a woman who had faced hardship and emerged victorious. She would play his game, but she would play it on her own terms. And she wouldn't rest until she'd reclaimed her freedom, her dignity, and her life. She straightened, took a deep breath, and started clearing the table. The air, she noticed, smelled a bit more like dust and a bit less like lavender. Change was in the air, a bitter wind, but a wind nonetheless. She would not be blown away. Chapter 4. Stakes higher than the desert sky. The Lucky Star Saloon, at 5:30 in the morning, was a desolate place. The remnants of the previous night's revelry littered the floor, overturned chairs, spilled drinks, and the lingering smell of stale smoke. Belle stood just inside the entrance, her apron tied tightly around her waist, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She felt a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach, a feeling she hadn't experienced since she was a girl, facing down a schoolyard bully. Cass Rhodes was nowhere to be seen. The only other person in the saloon was a grizzled old man, presumably the cleaner, sweeping the floor with slow, deliberate movements. He glanced at Belle, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and indifference, before returning to his task. Belle took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She was here, she was ready, and she would not let Cass Rhodes intimidate her. She would do her job, she would fulfill her obligation, and she would maintain her dignity, no matter what. She started by righting the overturned chairs, her movements stiff and awkward at first, then gaining confidence with each task. She wiped down the tables, her hands scrubbing away the sticky residue of spilled liquor and lost dreams. She swept the floor, her broom pushing aside the debris of broken glasses and shattered hopes. As she worked, she thought of Samuel. He'd been quiet that morning, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a somber silence. He'd offered to help her, to find a way to earn money to pay off his debt, but Belle had refused. This was her burden, her responsibility, and she would bear it alone. She thought of Thomas, her late husband. He would have been disappointed in her, she knew. He would have urged her to be more cautious, to avoid taking unnecessary risks. But he would have also understood her need to protect Samuel, to do whatever it took to keep him safe. And then, she thought of the stranger from the previous night. The man with the startling green eyes and the cryptic warning.
He's a complicated man.
Be careful.
What had he meant by that?
What did he know about Cass Rhodes that she didn't? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered, adding to the growing sense of unease that settled over her. She felt like she was walking on a tightrope, suspended high above a chasm of unknown dangers, with Cass Rhodes holding the rope, ready to cut it at any moment. The sound of footsteps startled her. She turned to see Cass Rhodes entering the saloon, his tall frame silhouetted against the brightening sky outside. He was dressed in a clean shirt and trousers, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. He looked different. Less menacing, perhaps. More human. "You're early," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a familiar shiver down Belle's spine. "I like to be punctual," Belle retorted, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. Cass's lips curved into a faint smile.
"Good," he said.
"Because I expect the same from my employees." He walked past her, towards the bar. "Start by cleaning the glasses," he said, his voice echoing in the empty saloon. "Then polish the bar. And make sure everything is spotless. I expect this place to shine." Belle nodded, her jaw clenched. She would do as he asked. She would follow his orders, but she would not be his servant. She would be his employee, nothing more, nothing less. She spent the next few hours working tirelessly, her body aching, her hands raw and sore. She cleaned the glasses, meticulously polishing each one until it sparkled. She scrubbed the bar, her arms burning with the effort. She swept and mopped the floor, her back protesting with every movement. Cass watched her, his eyes following her every move. He didn't speak, he didn't offer any help, he simply observed. His presence was a constant pressure, a silent reminder of her debt, of her obligation, of her loss. As the morning wore on, the saloon began to fill with the early risers, the miners, the ranchers, the merchants, all seeking a cup of coffee, a shot of whiskey, or a game of cards to start their day. Belle found herself thrust into the role of barmaid, serving drinks, taking orders, and navigating the crowded room with a practiced ease she didn't know she possessed. She learned to pour a perfect shot of whiskey, to mix a refreshing cocktail, to handle the rough and tumble customers with a firm hand and a polite smile. She learned to read their faces, to anticipate their needs, to deflect their unwanted advances with a subtle word or a well-placed glance. She also learned more about Cass Rhodes. She observed him interacting with his customers, his demeanor shifting from charming to calculating, from friendly to ruthless, depending on the situation. She saw the way he controlled the room, the way he manipulated the games, the way he always seemed to come out on top. She realized that he was a master of illusion, a conjurer of dreams, a weaver of webs that ensnared the unwary. He was a gambler, not just of cards, but of lives. And she was caught in his web, a pawn in his game. As the day began to fade, a group arrived, more boisterous and rough than the regular clientele. Belle recognized them as associates of a rival rancher, a man named Bartlett, who had a long-standing feud with one of Cass's most loyal patrons, Mr. Abernathy. Tension filled the saloon as the group settled near Abernathy's usual table. Cass, with a subtle nod, signaled Belle to approach. "Keep an eye on them, Belle," he murmured, his voice low and laced with warning. "And pour light."
Belle understood.
He was anticipating trouble, using her as both bait and observer. The stakes, she realized, were not just about money or pride anymore. This was about territory, about power, about the unspoken rules of the frontier. And she was caught in the middle, the potential spark to ignite a conflict that could burn down more than just the Lucky Star Saloon. She met Cass's gaze, the unspoken question clear. He only gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She was on her own. Chapter 5. Beneath the gaze of a setting Sunday. The tension in the Lucky Star Saloon thickened with the approaching twilight. The air, already heavy with the scent of whiskey and sweat, crackled with an unspoken animosity. Belle moved through the crowded room, her senses on high alert, her every nerve ending tingling with anticipation. She poured drinks, cleared tables, and exchanged polite words with the customers, all the while keeping a watchful eye on the two rival groups, Bartlett's men and Abernathy's. Bartlett's men were a rough bunch, their faces weathered and scarred, their eyes hardened by a life lived on the edge. They spoke in loud voices, their laughter harsh and grating, their movements deliberately provocative. Abernathy's group, in contrast, were more subdued, their faces grim, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. They sat quietly, their hands never far from their holsters, their silence more menacing than any shouted threat. Cass Rhodes remained behind the bar, his presence a calming influence, or so it seemed. He polished glasses, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes constantly scanning the room. He was a predator, Belle realized, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. And she was his unwitting accomplice, his bait, his eyes and ears in the crowded room. As the evening wore on, the taunts and insults between the two groups escalated. Belle found herself caught in the crossfire, her presence a convenient excuse for the men to exchange veiled threats and provocative glances. She poured drinks with a steady hand, her smile fixed, her heart pounding in her chest. She noticed the subtle signals, the unspoken cues, the shifting alliances within the room. She saw the way Cass manipulated the situation, his words carefully chosen, his actions deliberately ambiguous. He was playing both sides, she realized, fanning the flames of conflict while maintaining a facade of neutrality. She also noticed the stranger from the previous night, standing in the shadows near the entrance, his green eyes watching her intently. He seemed to be concerned, worried. She wondered, again, what he knew about Cass Rhodes, what secrets he held, what role he played in this dangerous game. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, painting the walls with hues of orange and purple. The light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, creating an ethereal, almost surreal atmosphere. The beauty of the scene contrasted sharply with the ugliness of the situation, the simmering hatred, the impending violence. A sudden silence fell over the room. Belle looked up, her heart skipping a beat. Bartlett's men had risen from their table, their hands hovering over their holsters. Abernathy's group followed suit, their faces grim, their eyes narrowed. Cass Rhodes stepped forward, his voice calm and authoritative. "Gentlemen," he said, his gaze sweeping over the two groups. "I believe we can resolve this misunderstanding peacefully." His words seemed to hang in the air, a fragile truce suspended between two warring factions. But Belle knew it wouldn't last. The tension was too thick, the hatred too deep, the stakes too high. A single shot rang out, shattering the silence. Belle ducked instinctively, her body hitting the floor behind the bar. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, chairs overturned, glasses shattered. The room became a whirlwind of fists, boots, and flying objects. Belle crawled on her hands and knees, seeking shelter from the melee. She saw Cass Rhodes, his face a mask of fury, fighting his way through the crowd, his fists striking with brutal force. She saw Abernathy, his face bloodied, his gun drawn, firing wildly into the air. She saw Bartlett's men, their faces contorted with rage, their knives flashing in the dim light. And then she saw him, the stranger. He was moving through the chaos with a grace and agility that belied his size. He wasn't fighting, not exactly. He was intervening, disarming men, deflecting blows, pulling people out of harm's way. He was a force of nature, a calm center in the storm. He saw her, crouched behind the bar, her eyes wide with fear. He moved towards her, his movements swift and purposeful. He reached down, his hand outstretched, his green eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Something that made Belle's heart ache with a longing she hadn't felt in years. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It's not safe here." Belle hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She didn't know this man. She didn't trust him. But she knew she couldn't stay here. She was in danger, caught in a crossfire that was not of her making. She took his hand, his grip firm and reassuring. He pulled her to her feet, his body shielding hers from the flying debris. He led her towards the back door, his movements swift and decisive. As they reached the door, a figure emerged from the shadows, one of Bartlett's men, his face contorted with rage, a knife clutched in his hand. He lunged towards Belle, his eyes filled with murderous intent. The stranger reacted instantly. He pushed Belle behind him, his body intercepting the blow. The knife plunged into his shoulder, a sickening thud echoing in the sudden silence. The stranger staggered, his face contorted with pain. But he didn't fall. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on Belle's, his grip on her hand tightening. "Go," he whispered, his voice strained.
"Run."
Belle stared at him, her eyes filled with horror. She couldn't leave him. Not like this. But she knew she had to. She had to escape, to survive. Tears streamed down her face as she wrenched open the back door, the cool night air slap against her heated skin. She could hear the renewed sounds of fighting inside, but she didn't look back.
She ran.
She had to get help, for him, and she fled, a prayer and a desperate plea intertwining in her heart. Chapter 6. Echoes of Loss in the Canyon's Heart. Belle ran blindly through the darkened streets of Dust Devil Gulch, her lungs burning, her legs aching, her heart pounding in her chest. The sounds of the brawl faded behind her, replaced by the rhythmic thud of her own footsteps and the frantic whisper of her breath. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away, to find help, to save the stranger who had risked his life for hers. She ran past the darkened storefronts, the empty saloons, the silent boarding houses, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and desperation. She finally stumbled upon the sheriff's office, a small, dilapidated building on the edge of town. The door was locked, the windows dark. Belle pounded on the door, her fists hammering against the wood, her voice hoarse with desperation. "Help!"
she cried. "Please."
"There's been a fight at the Lucky Star. A man's been stabbed." No answer. She pounded again, harder this time, her knuckles raw and bleeding.
Still nothing.
Belle slumped against the door, her body trembling with exhaustion and despair. She was alone, helpless, with no one to turn to. The sheriff, she knew, was a corrupt and ineffectual man, more interested in lining his pockets than in upholding the law. He was probably in league with Cass Rhodes, she realized, another pawn in his twisted game. She looked up at the sky, the vast expanse of the desert night stretching out above her, the stars twinkling coldly in the distance. She felt a wave of loneliness wash over her, a feeling she hadn't experienced since Thomas had died. She was alone, adrift in a world of danger and uncertainty, with no one to protect her, no one to care for her. And then she remembered. The stranger. His green eyes, his gentle touch, his selfless act of courage. He was out there somewhere bleeding, possibly dying. And she was the only one who could help him. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaky, her body protesting with every movement. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let him die. She would find him, she would help him, and she would somehow, someway make things right. She started walking, her steps slow and deliberate, her eyes scanning the darkened streets. She didn't know where to go, where to look, but she had to try. She had to find him. She walked for what seemed like hours, her feet aching, her body exhausted. She passed the darkened houses, the empty lots, the silent alleys, her hope dwindling with each passing moment. And then she saw it. A faint light flickering in the distance. A small cabin, nestled in the shadow of a towering mesa, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. Belle's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could he be there? She started running, her legs pumping, her lungs burning. She ran towards the light, her hope rekindled, her determination renewed. She reached the cabin, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She didn't know who lived here, what dangers might await her. But she had no choice. She had to take the risk. She knocked on the door, her knuckles rapping against the wood. A moment of silence, then the sound of footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and Belle found herself face to face with an old woman. She was small and frail, her face wrinkled and weathered, her eyes bright and alert. She wore a simple, homespun dress, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked at Belle, her gaze questioning, her expression wary. "Can I help you, child?" she asked, her voice raspy with age. Belle swallowed, her throat dry. "I'm looking for a man," she said, her voice trembling. "He's been hurt, stabbed. He saved my life." The old woman's eyes narrowed. "What man?" she asked. "What are you talking about?" Belle described the stranger, his tall frame, his dark hair, his green eyes, his leather jacket, the knife wound in his shoulder. She described the fight at the Lucky Star, her desperate escape, her search for help. The old woman listened intently, her expression unchanging. When Belle had finished, she paused for a moment, her gaze searching Belle's face. "Come in, child," she said, her voice softening. "You're safe here." She stepped aside, inviting Belle into the cabin. Belle hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The inside of the cabin was small and cozy, with a large stone hearth occupying one entire wall. A fire was blazing there, providing a surprising amount of heat. On a simple cot near the fire lay the stranger, his face pale and drawn, a bandage wrapped around his shoulder. He was alive. "He calls himself John," the old woman said, gesturing to the cot. "He came to me, said he knew I could help. He's a good man, despite what people say." She glanced down. "You go to him, I'll bring some water." Belle approached the cot, gratitude flooding her heart. It was a risk coming here, but now she could help him. As she sat on the edge of the cot, their eyes met. He smiled, a weak, shaky thing. "You came back." His voice was low, a rough whisper.
"Belle Nodette, tires forma."
"I had to." Just then, the old woman returned, and they set to work. It was not a conversation, but it didn't need to be. The canyon held its secrets, and for now, held them safe. Chapter 7. The Price of Freedom and Forgiveness. The old woman, who introduced herself as Martha, proved to be a skilled healer. Her cabin, though small, was filled with an assortment of herbs, tinctures, and bandages, all neatly organized and labeled. She worked on John's wound with a quiet efficiency, her wrinkled hands surprisingly strong and steady. Belle assisted as best she could, fetching water, holding bandages, and offering words of comfort to John, whose face was often contorted with pain. She learned that Martha lived a solitary life, shunned by the townsfolk of Dust Devil Gulch, who whispered rumors of her being a witch, a recluse, a woman touched by darkness. But Belle saw only kindness in her eyes, a quiet strength, and a deep understanding of the healing power of nature. John's wound was deep, but thankfully, not life-threatening. Martha cleaned and stitched it, applying a poultice of herbs that smelled of earth and sage. She instructed Belle on how to care for him, how to change the bandages, how to brew the herbal teas that would help him heal. As the days passed, Belle stayed at the cabin, tending to John, learning from Martha, and finding a strange sense of peace in the quiet solitude of the canyon. She slept on a small pallet on the floor, her sleep often interrupted by John's restless movements and muffled groans. But she didn't mind. She was grateful to be there, grateful to be able to repay the debt she owed him, grateful for the unexpected friendship that had blossomed between them. She learned that John was, indeed, a complicated man. He was a drifter, a wanderer, a man with a past he refused to discuss. He was reticent, guarded, his green eyes often clouded with a sadness that Belle couldn't fathom. But he was also kind, gentle, and surprisingly vulnerable. He had a quiet strength, a resilience that mirrored her own, and a deep sense of honor that resonated with her soul. He told her about his life on the trail, the dangers he'd faced, the people he'd met, the landscapes he'd crossed. He spoke of the beauty of the desert, the vastness of the sky, the freedom of the open road. But he never spoke of his past, of the events that had led him to Dust Devil Gulch, of the reasons why he'd intervened in the fight at the Lucky Star. Belle, in turn, shared her own story. She told him about Thomas, her late husband, about Samuel, her impulsive brother, about the boarding house she'd built, about the gamble she'd lost, about the debt she owed to Cass Rhodes. She spoke of her fears, her regrets, her hopes for the future. John listened intently, his green eyes filled with empathy and understanding. He didn't judge her, he didn't offer platitudes, he simply listened. And in his silence, Belle found a comfort she hadn't known she was seeking. One evening, as the sun set over the canyon, painting the sky with fiery hues of orange and red, John finally spoke of Cass Rhodes. "He's a dangerous man, Belle," he said, his voice low and serious. "He's not just a gambler. He's something more. Something darker." Belle nodded, her heart heavy with apprehension. "I know," she said. "I've seen it. The way he manipulates people, the way he controls the town, the way he always seems to come out on top. He has a hold on this town," John continued. "A power that goes beyond money and influence. He has secrets, Belle. Secrets that could destroy him and anyone connected to him." "What kind of secrets?" Belle asked, her voice trembling. John hesitated, his gaze searching the distance. "I can't tell you," he said. "Not yet. It's too dangerous. But I promise you, Belle, I'll do everything I can to protect you, to help you get free of him." Belle looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something more. Something that made her heart ache with a longing she hadn't felt in years. She saw the strength in his face, the kindness in his eyes, the vulnerability that he tried so hard to conceal. She saw a man who had been wounded, physically and emotionally, but who still had the courage to fight, to protect, to care. "Why?" she asked, her voice low. "Why are you doing this? Risking everything?" He met her gaze, a small smile forming. "Because, Belle Carter," he began, "you're worth it." She blushed. A warmth, unfamiliar, bloomed in her chest. The price of her freedom, she realized, might be higher than she'd ever imagined. It might cost her heart. And for the first time in a long time, the thought of that loss didn't entirely terrify her. It was a different kind of gamble, one with the potential for a reward far greater than she had ever dreamed. But first, there were old debts to settle, Cass Rhodes among them. The sun slipped beneath the horizon. The first star, a brilliant pinpoint, shone in the darkening sky. Forgiveness, Belle felt, might be found under the sky, but only after a reckoning. Chapter 8. A Dance with Danger and Desire. Belle returned to Dust Devil Gulch a week later, her heart pounding with a mixture of trepidation and determination. John was still recovering, but he was strong enough to be left in Martha's capable hands. He'd insisted that Belle return, that she face Cass Rhodes, that she reclaim her life. He'd promised to follow, to be there for her, when the time was right. The town seemed unchanged, the dusty streets, the weathered buildings, the familiar faces, all exactly as she'd left them. But Belle felt different. She was no longer the naive, vulnerable woman who had gambled away her freedom. She was stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever to break free from Cass Rhodes's grasp. She went straight to the Lucky Star Saloon, her head held high, her gaze unwavering. The saloon was bustling with activity, the usual mix of miners, ranchers, and drifters filling the room. Cass Rhodes was behind the bar, his eyes scanning the crowd, his demeanor as cool and calculating as ever. He saw her, his eyebrows rising slightly, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He didn't speak, he simply watched her as she approached the bar. "I'm back," Belle said, her voice steady, her gaze meeting his. "Ready to work." Cass's lips curved into a faint smile. "I wondered when you'd show up," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a familiar shiver down Belle's spine. "Thought you might have run off with your friend." Belle's heart skipped a beat. He knew. He knew about John. She forced herself to remain calm, to conceal her fear. "I made a bargain, Mr. Rhodes," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I intend to honor it. But I also intend to be treated with respect. I'm not your slave. I'm your employee." Cass leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're in no position to make demands, Belle," he said softly. "You owe me. And I intend to collect. I'll work, Belle retorted.
I'll do my job.
But I won't be bullied. I won't be intimidated. And I won't be used. Cass studied her for a moment, his gaze intense, his expression unreadable. Then, to Belle's surprise, he chuckled. You've got spirit, Belle, he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. I'll give you that.
All right.
You'll work.
But you'll do as I say.
And you'll stay out of trouble. He gestured towards the back room. Start by cleaning up in there, he said. And then get behind the bar. It's going to be a busy night. Belle nodded, her jaw clenched. She would do as he asked. She would follow his orders. But she would not be broken. She would bide her time. She would watch. She would learn. And she would wait for the opportunity to strike back. The night was indeed busy. The saloon was packed with customers, the air thick with smoke, the noise deafening. Belle worked tirelessly, serving drinks, clearing tables, and navigating the crowded room with a practiced ease she'd honed during her previous stint. She noticed the subtle changes, the undercurrents of tension that simmered beneath the surface. She saw the way Cass interacted with his customers, the way he manipulated the games, the way he always seemed to be one step ahead. She also noticed the whispers, the rumors, the speculation about John's disappearance. Some said he'd run off, others said he'd been killed, still others whispered that he was hiding, plotting his revenge. Belle ignored the rumors, focusing on her work, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. She knew she couldn't confront Cass directly, not yet. She needed leverage, she needed information, she needed something. As the night wore on, a familiar figure entered the saloon, the sheriff. He was a portly man, his face red and sweaty, his eyes shifty and evasive. He approached Cass, his demeanor obsequious, his voice hushed. Belle watched them, her senses on high alert. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw the way Cass handed the sheriff a wad of cash, the way the sheriff nodded eagerly, the way he glanced nervously around the room. It was clear that Cass was bribing the sheriff, buying his silence, his cooperation, his protection. Belle felt a surge of anger, a burning desire for justice. She knew she had to do something to expose Cass's corruption, to bring him down. But how? She was just one woman, against a man who seemed to control the entire town. She had no power, no influence, no allies. Except John. She thought of him, recovering in Martha's cabin, his green eyes filled with determination, his voice promising to protect her. He was her only hope, her only chance to break free from Cass Rhodes's grasp. As the night drew to a close, Belle found herself alone with Cass behind the bar. He was counting the day's takings, his face illuminated by the flickering lamplight. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. You did well tonight, Belle, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Better than I expected. Belle didn't respond, her gaze unwavering. Cass sighed, his expression softening. I know you hate me, Belle, he said. And I don't blame you. I've done things I'm not proud of. But I had my reasons. Reasons? Belle retorted, her voice laced with sarcasm. What reasons could possibly justify your actions? Your cruelty? Your corruption? Cass looked away, his gaze fixed on the stacks of money before him. Survival, Belle, he said softly. In this world, you do what you have to do to survive. You play the hand you're dealt. And you don't let anyone stand in your way. And what about the people you hurt along the way?
Belle précède.
The lives you ruin? The debts you collect? Cass's eyes met hers, his expression hardening. They're casualties of the game, Belle, he said. Collateral damage. It's the price of freedom. Your freedom, Belle corrected. Not theirs. A tense silence filled the space between them. The dance had begun, a dangerous waltz between captor and captive, fueled by desire, resentment, and the unspoken secrets that simmered beneath the surface. The desire, Belle realized with a jolt, was not one-sided. She saw it flicker in his eyes, a brief, unguarded moment of vulnerability. He wanted her, not just as a pawn, but as a woman. And that, she knew, could be her most potent weapon. Or her undoing. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. You're different, Belle Carter. You have fire.
I like fire.
He reached out a hand, almost touching her cheek, but paused, withdrawing at the last second. But fire can burn you. She didn't flinch. I'm not afraid of fire, Mr. Rhodes. Maybe you should be. She turned and walked away, leaving him staring after her, the unspoken challenge hanging heavy in the air. Chapter 9. The unseen scars of yesterday. The days that followed settled into a tense routine. Belle worked at the Lucky Star, her every move scrutinized by Cass, her every interaction with the customers carefully observed. She endured his subtle taunts, his veiled threats, his constant reminders of her debt. But she also saw glimpses of something else in him, something that hinted at a deeper, more complex man beneath the ruthless exterior. She saw the weariness in his eyes, the lines of stress etched around his mouth, the occasional flicker of regret that crossed his features. She heard the stories whispered about him, the rumors of a past life, a lost love, a betrayal that had hardened his heart. She learned that he'd come from the East, from a wealthy family, that he'd been educated, refined, a man of privilege and promise. But something had happened, something that had driven him west, that had transformed him into the cynical, ruthless gambler he was today. Belle found herself increasingly intrigued by him, drawn to the mystery that surrounded him, the secrets he held so close. She knew it was dangerous, this fascination, this attraction. But she couldn't help herself. She was playing a dangerous game, a dance of desire and deception, and she was determined to win. She also kept in contact with John, sending messages through Martha, who occasionally visited the town to purchase supplies. John was recovering well, his strength returning, his determination to help Belle unwavering. He urged her to be patient, to gather information, to wait for the right opportunity to strike back. Belle used her position at the Lucky Star to her advantage. She listened to the conversations of the customers, she observed their interactions, she pieced together the intricate web of relationships and rivalries that defined Dust Devil Gulch. She learned about the corrupt sheriff, the crooked merchants, the land disputes, the hidden alliances, the simmering feuds. She discovered that Cass Rhodes was involved in more than just gambling. He was involved in land grabbing, in smuggling, in manipulating the local elections, in controlling the flow of money and power in the town. He was a puppet master, pulling the strings of the town's inhabitants, enriching himself at their expense. One evening, as Belle was cleaning up after closing, she found a small, locked box hidden beneath the bar. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she shouldn't open it, that it was a violation of Cass's privacy, that it could be dangerous. But her curiosity, her desire for information, her need to find a way to break free from his grasp, overwhelmed her caution. She found a hairpin, her fingers fumbling with the lock. After several tense minutes, she heard a click, and the box sprang open. Inside, she found a collection of letters, old and faded, tied together with a ribbon. She carefully untied the ribbon, her hands trembling with anticipation. She unfolded the first letter, her eyes scanning the delicate handwriting. The letter was from a woman named Sarah. It was a love letter, filled with passion, with longing, with promises of a future together. Belle read on, her heart aching with a sadness she couldn't explain. The letters chronicled a love affair, a forbidden romance between Cass and Sarah, a woman who was betrothed to another man, a powerful and wealthy man who controlled the town where they lived. The letters spoke of secret meetings, stolen kisses, whispered vows, and a desperate hope for a future that seemed impossible. And then the letters stopped. Abruptly. Belle searched through the box, her heart pounding with a growing sense of dread. She found a final letter, this one addressed to Cass, from Sarah's brother. The letter was brief, blunt, and brutal. It informed Cass that Sarah was dead, that she had been murdered by her fiancé. Belle gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a surge of empathy for the man she had come to despise. She understood now. His ruthlessness, his cynicism, his hardened heart. It was a shield, a defense against the pain, the loss, the betrayal he had suffered. She carefully placed the letters back in the box, her mind racing. She had found his weakness, his vulnerability, the chink in his armor. But she also felt a strange sense of compassion. She saw him now not just as a villain, but as a victim. A man who had been broken by love, by loss, by the cruelty of the world. She knew what the unseen scars of yesterday truly meant. It wasn't just about the physical battles, but the emotional wounds carried, hidden beneath layers of grit and bravado. Cass, she realized, was as much a prisoner of his past as she was of her present circumstances. She closed the box and returned it where it lay. She would use this new information, but she would be careful. He had loved, and he had lost. She would not underestimate him, and would instead find the path that helped them both. Chapter 10. Rivers of Tears and Redemption. The knowledge Belle had gained about Cass's past changed everything. It didn't erase his cruelty, his corruption, his manipulation. But it gave her a new perspective, a deeper understanding of the man behind the mask. She saw him now as a wounded soul, a man trapped in a cycle of pain and revenge, a man desperately seeking redemption, even if he didn't realize it himself. She continued to work at the Lucky Star, her interactions with Cass subtly shifting. She was no longer simply defiant, rebellious. She was empathetic. She listened more, she observed more, she tried to understand the motivations behind his actions, the reasons for his choices. She also began to subtly challenge him, to push him, to force him to confront his own demons. She did it carefully, subtly, using her words, her actions, her very presence to chip away at the wall he'd built around his heart. One evening, as they were closing up, Belle found Cass staring out the window at the setting sun, his face etched with a sadness she'd come to recognize. She approached him, her steps silent on the wooden floor. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly, her gaze following his. "The desert, the sky, the way the light changes everything." Cass didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It reminds me of her," he said, his voice barely a whisper.
Sarah.
She loved the sunsets. Belle's heart ached for him. She knew the pain of losing a loved one, the emptiness, the longing, the constant reminder of what had been lost. "She sounds like she was a wonderful woman," Belle said gently. Cass nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears.
"She was," he said, "the best.
"The kindest, the most beautiful soul I've ever known." "And you loved her very much," Belle added, her voice soft. Cass turned to her, his eyes filled with a raw pain that took Belle's breath away.
"More than anything," he said.
"More than life itself. And she loved you," Belle said, her voice unwavering. "I know she did. I read the letters." Cass's eyes widened, his expression a mixture of shock and anger.
"You what?"
he said, his voice rising. "You went through my things? You violated my privacy?" Belle stood her ground, her gaze meeting his. "I did," she said. "And I'm not sorry. I needed to understand you. To understand why you are the way you are." "And do you?" Cass challenged, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Do you understand now? Do you condone my actions? My cruelty? My corruption?" "No," Belle said. "I don't condone them. But I understand the pain that drives you, the loss that haunts you, the desire for revenge that consumes you." Cass looked away, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Revenge won't bring her back," he said softly. "It won't ease the pain. It won't change anything." "No," Belle agreed. "It won't. But forgiveness might." Cass's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers. "Forgiveness?" he said, his voice incredulous. "Forgive him? The man who murdered her? The man who stole my future? The man who destroyed my life?" "Forgive yourself," Belle said gently, "for not being able to save her, for letting her grief consume you, for becoming the man you are today." Cass stared at her, his expression unreadable. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. He turned away, his shoulders slumping, his body trembling. Belle approached him, her hand gently touching his arm. "It's not too late, Cass," she said softly. "It's never too late to change.
To heal."
To find redemption. Cass turned to her, his eyes filled with tears. He reached out, his hand cupping her face, his thumb gently wiping away a tear that had escaped her own eye. "You see me, don't you?" he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You see past the mask. You see the man I used to be. The man I could be again." Belle nodded, her heart aching for him. "I do," she said. "And I believe in you. I believe you can change. I believe you can find peace." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, his body trembling against hers. He buried his face in her hair, his sobs muffled against her shoulder. Belle held him, her arms embracing him, her heart filled with a mixture of compassion, empathy, and something more. It was a moment of profound connection, a shared vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement of the pain they had both endured, the losses they had both suffered. It was a moment of healing, of forgiveness, of redemption. The rivers of tears, long dammed up by pride and pain, finally flowed. And in that shared sorrow, a new seed of hope was planted, fragile but tenacious, in the barren landscape of their hearts. It was a turning point, a shift in the balance of power, a beginning of a new chapter in their intertwined stories. Chapter 11. A bargain struck under a pale moon. The embrace between Belle and Cass lingered, a silent testament to the shared pain and the burgeoning hope that had blossomed between them. The saloon, once a battleground of wills and unspoken desires, felt transformed, imbued with a fragile sense of peace. When they finally parted, the air crackled with a new kind of energy. It wasn't the tense, adversarial dynamic of before, but something deeper, more complex. Acknowledgement, understanding, and perhaps the first tentative tendrils of trust. Cass ran a hand through his hair, his eyes still red-rimmed, but his expression softer, less guarded. I don't know what to say, Belle," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "You've shown me more kindness than I deserve."
Belle smiled gently.
"We all deserve kindness, Cass," she said. "And we all make mistakes. It's what we do after that matters." Cass nodded, his gaze searching hers. "What do we do now, Belle?" he asked, his voice low and uncertain. "What happens to us?" Belle hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was a pivotal moment, a turning point in their relationship, in their lives. She had to choose her words carefully, to be honest, to be brave. "I don't know, Cass," she admitted. "But I know I can't go back to the way things were. I can't be your employee, your debtor, your pawn." Cass's expression hardened slightly. "Are you leaving?" he asked, a hint of fear in his voice. "No," Belle said quickly. "Not if you'll have me, but on different terms. As partners. Equals." Cass's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Partners?" he repeated, his voice incredulous. "You want to be my partner? In the Lucky Star? In everything?" Belle nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I do," she said. "I believe we can make this work, Cass. We can change things. We can make this town a better place. We can build a future together." Cass studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, his expression unreadable. Then, a slow smile spread across his face. "You're a remarkable woman, Belle Carter," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "You're bold, you're brave, and you're surprisingly forgiving." He extended his hand, his gaze meeting hers. "All right, Belle," he said. "Partners. We'll do this together. We'll clean up this town, starting with the Lucky Star. We'll rewrite the rules." Belle took his hand, her grip firm, her heart filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. It was a gamble, a huge gamble. But it was a gamble she was willing to take. "But," Cass continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "there's one condition." Belle's heart skipped a beat. "What condition?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Cass leaned closer, his breath warm on her ear. "That you allow me to court you, Belle Carter," he said softly. "Properly. As a man courting a woman he admires. A woman he hesitated, his gaze searching hers, his expression vulnerable. A woman he's falling in love with," he finished, his voice barely a whisper. Belle's breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, her eyes wide with surprise, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected this open declaration, this vulnerability. She searched his eyes, seeking any sign of deception, of manipulation. But she found only sincerity, only honesty, only love. She smiled, a slow, radiant smile that lit up her face. "I would like that very much, Cass Rhodes," she said softly. "Very much." He smiled back, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his face transformed by a joy she hadn't seen before. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss that sent a shiver of electricity through her body. It was a kiss of promise, of hope, of a future they would build together, a future free from the shadows of the past. The moon, a pale disk in the inky sky, cast its silvery light through the saloon windows, illuminating the two figures standing close together, their hands clasped, their hearts intertwined. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, a bargain struck under a pale moon, a bargain sealed with a kiss. Outside, the sounds of the night continued, the distant howls of coyotes, the gentle whisper of the wind. But inside the Lucky Star Saloon, there was only silence, a profound, peaceful silence that spoke volumes about the transformation that had taken place, the love that had blossomed in the most unexpected of places. But Belle also knew, with a chilling certainty, that the peace was fragile. The outside world, with its corruption and its dangers, would soon intrude. Sheriff Hogan, Bartlett's men, and the tangled web of Cass's past dealings wouldn't simply disappear. A new bargain had been made, but the old debts, in some form, would still need to be paid. The question was, at what cost? Chapter 12. The Weight of Silence and Secrets. The days following the agreement between Belle and Cass were filled with a cautious optimism. They worked side by side, transforming the Lucky Star from a den of iniquity into a more respectable establishment. They cleaned, they renovated, they implemented new rules, and they treated their customers with fairness and respect. The change was noticeable. The atmosphere in the saloon became lighter, more welcoming. The rough and tumble element still existed, but it was tempered by a new sense of order, of decency. The townsfolk, initially skeptical, began to appreciate the changes, drawn in by the improved service, the fairer games, and the genuine warmth that Belle brought to the establishment. Cass, too, was changing. He was still a gambler, still a shrewd businessman, but he was also softer.
Kinder.
More open. He smiled more, he laughed more, and he treated Belle with a respect and affection that was both surprising and heartwarming. He courted her, as he'd promised, with a quiet intensity that took Belle's breath away. He brought her wildflowers, he read her poetry, he shared stories of his childhood, his dreams, his regrets. He showed her a side of himself that he'd kept hidden for so long, a vulnerable, sensitive side that resonated with her own wounded heart. Belle, in turn, blossomed under his attention. She found herself falling in love with him, deeply, irrevocably. She loved his strength, his resilience, his hidden vulnerability, his dry wit, his surprising gentleness. She loved the way he looked at her, the way he touched her, the way he made her feel alive. But beneath the surface of their newfound happiness, a current of unease persisted. The secrets of Cass's past, the enemies he'd made, the debts he still owed, hung over them like a dark cloud, threatening to shatter their fragile peace. Sheriff Hogan continued to visit the Lucky Star, his demeanor increasingly nervous, his demands for money more frequent and more insistent. Cass paid him, reluctantly, knowing that it was a temporary solution, a way to buy time, to protect Belle and their burgeoning business. Bartlett's men also continued to frequent the saloon, their presence a constant reminder of the simmering feud, the potential for violence. Cass handled them carefully, walking a tightrope between appeasement and defiance, trying to avoid a confrontation that could destroy everything they'd built. And then there was John. He'd recovered from his wound, but he remained in hiding, communicating with Belle through Martha. He was wary of Cass, suspicious of his motives, convinced that he was still a dangerous man. He urged Belle to be careful, to be vigilant, to be prepared for the inevitable betrayal. Belle was torn. She loved Cass, she believed in him, but she also trusted John. She valued his friendship. She knew he had her best interests at heart. She found herself caught in the middle, between two men who represented two different paths, two different futures. One evening, as Belle and Cass were closing up, a stranger entered the saloon. He was a tall, imposing man, his face weathered and scarred, his eyes cold and calculating. He wore a long, black coat, a gun belt strapped low on his hips, his demeanor radiating danger. Cass's expression hardened, his hand instinctively moving towards the gun he kept hidden beneath the bar. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled tension. The stranger's lips curved into a cruel smile. "I believe you can, Rhodes," he said, his voice a low growl. "My name is Silas. Silas Blackwood. And I'm here to collect a debt." Belle's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the name. Silas Blackwood. He was a notorious outlaw, a hired gun, a man known for his ruthlessness, his brutality, his complete lack of mercy. "I don't know you," Cass said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "You know my employer," Silas countered, his smile widening. "The man you betrayed. The man you left for dead. The man who wants his revenge." Cass's face paled slightly, but he didn't flinch.
I don't know what you're talking about, he said.
Silas chuckled, a cold, chilling sound. "Don't play coy with me, Rhodes," he said. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. You stole from him. You double-crossed him, and you left him to rot. Now he wants what's his.
And he wants you dead."
Belle felt a surge of fear, a desperate need to protect Cass. She stepped forward, her hand reaching for his. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "He's changed. He's not the man you think he is." Silas turned his gaze to Belle, his eyes raking over her, his expression filled with disdain. "And who are you?" he sneered. "His whore? His accomplice? His latest victim?" "I'm his partner," Belle retorted, her voice rising. "And I won't let you hurt him." Silas laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. You're going to stop me? You're nothing, woman. A pawn in his game. A fool who's been blinded by his lies." He turned back to Cass, his hand hovering over his gun. "I'm giving you one chance, Rhodes," he said. "Come with me, quietly, and maybe, just maybe, I'll let the woman live." Cass's eyes met Belle's, his expression filled with a mixture of fear, regret, and love. He knew he couldn't fight Silas, not here, not now. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and he wouldn't risk Belle's life. He nodded, his jaw clenched. "All right, Blackwood," he said. "I'll go with you."
"Cass, no,"
Belle cried, her voice filled with desperation.
"Don't do it."
"He'll kill you." Cass smiled sadly, his hand gently touching her cheek. "I have to, Belle," he said softly. "It's the only way.
To protect you.
To protect us." The silence that followed was heavy, weighted down by unspoken fears, regrets, and a love that might be facing its ultimate test. The weight of Cass's past, a heavy shroud, had finally descended, threatening to extinguish the fragile flame of their future. Belle looked into his eyes and knew this could be goodbye. Chapter 13. Trails of Trust and Betrayal. Belle watched, helpless, as Silas Blackwood led Cass away, his gun pressed against Cass's back, his eyes cold and menacing. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to stop them, but she knew it was futile. She was no match for Silas, a seasoned killer, a man with nothing to lose. As soon as they were gone, Belle raced to the back door, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to get help, to find John, to somehow, someway save Cass. She ran through the darkened streets of Dust Devil Gulch, her mind racing, her lungs burning. She knew where to find Martha's cabin, the secluded hideout where John had been recovering. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her, her fear fueling her speed, her desperation driving her forward. She reached the cabin, breathless and frantic, pounding on the door. Martha opened it, her eyes wide with surprise, her expression filled with concern.
Belle?
What's wrong? What's happened? Belle stumbled inside, her words tumbling out in a rush. Cass, Silas Blackwood. He took him. He's going to kill him. We have to help him. Martha's face paled, her eyes hardening with determination.
John.
She called out, her voice sharp and urgent. John, come quickly. John appeared almost instantly, his face still bearing the faint scars of his wound, his green eyes filled with alarm. What is it, Belle? What's going on? Belle quickly explained the situation, her voice trembling with fear and desperation. She told him about Silas Blackwood, about the debt Cass owed, about the threat to his life. John listened intently, his expression grim, his jaw clenched. When she'd finished, he nodded, his eyes resolute. We'll get him back, Belle, he said, his voice firm and reassuring. I promise you. We'll find him, and we'll bring him home. He turned to Martha. Get your rifle, Martha, he said, and saddle the horses. We're going after them. Martha nodded, her movements swift and efficient. She disappeared into the back room, returning moments later with a rifle, a shotgun, and a bag filled with supplies. John strapped on his gun belt, his movements practiced and precise. He looked at Belle, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. You stay here, Belle, he said. It's too dangerous. I'll handle this. Belle shook her head, her eyes blazing with defiance.
No, she said.
I'm going with you. Cass is my partner. I won't abandon him. John hesitated, his gaze searching hers. He knew he couldn't dissuade her, that her determination was as strong as his own. All right, he said, his voice softening. But you stay close to me, and you do exactly as I say. Understand? Belle nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. They rode out into the night, the three of them, an unlikely trio bound together by a shared purpose, a desperate hope to save the man they both cared for, in their own way. John led the way, his eyes scanning the horizon, his senses alert for any sign of Silas and Cass. They followed the trail, a faint track of hoof prints and broken branches, leading them deeper into the desert, towards the rugged mountains that loomed in the distance. The night was cold, the wind biting at their faces, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the occasional howl of a coyote. As they rode, Belle couldn't help but think about Cass, about the love they had found, the future they had planned, the life they had hoped to build together. She prayed that he was still alive, that they would reach him in time, that they could somehow, someway, overcome this seemingly insurmountable obstacle. She also thought about John, about his unwavering loyalty, his selfless courage, his willingness to risk his life for a man he barely knew, a man he considered a rival. She was grateful for his friendship, his support, his strength. The trail led them to a narrow canyon, its walls towering above them, casting long, dark shadows. John reined in his horse, his eyes narrowed, his senses on high alert. This is it, he said, his voice low and cautious. They're in here. Somewhere. He dismounted, handing the reins to Martha.
Stay here with the horses, he said.
And be ready to run if you need to. He turned to Belle, his eyes filled with concern.
Stay close to me, he said.
And don't make a sound. Belle nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She followed John into the canyon, her senses heightened, her every nerve ending tingling with anticipation. They moved slowly, silently, their footsteps muffled by the soft sand. The canyon was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of a lizard or the distant cry of a hawk. And then they heard it, a muffled shout, followed by the sound of a struggle, coming from somewhere deeper within the canyon. John quickened his pace, his hand on his gun, his eyes scanning the shadows. Belle followed close behind, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. They rounded a bend in the canyon, and there they saw them. Cass, bound and gagged, his face bruised and bloodied, struggling against his captor. Silas Blackwood, standing over him, a cruel smile on his face, his gun pointed at Cass's head. The trails of trust and betrayal converged, in this desolate canyon. The past had caught up, and the future hung precariously in the balance, dependent on the next few desperate moves. Chapter 14. Among the ruins of broken vows. The scene that unfolded before Belle and John was a tableau of violence and desperation. Cass, bound and helpless, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. Silas Blackwood, his face contorted with a cruel satisfaction, his finger tightening on the trigger of his gun. John reacted instantly. He raised his rifle, his movements swift and precise, his aim unwavering. "Blackwood," he shouted, his voice echoing through the canyon. "Drop your weapon."
"Now."
Silas whirled around, his eyes widening in surprise, his gun swinging towards John. But John was faster. He fired, the shot ringing out through the canyon, the bullet striking Silas in the shoulder. Silas cried out in pain, his gun falling from his hand, his body staggering backwards. He clutched his wounded shoulder, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and disbelief. John moved quickly, his rifle trained on Silas, his eyes cold and hard. "Don't move, Blackwood," he said, his voice low and menacing, "or the next one will be between your eyes." Belle rushed to Cass, her hands fumbling with the ropes that bound him, her heart pounding in her chest. She quickly untied him, her eyes searching his, her voice filled with concern.
"Cass,
"Are you all right? Are you hurt?" Cass nodded, his face bruised and bloodied, his eyes filled with relief and gratitude. "I'm okay, Belle," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thanks to you and John." He looked at John, who was still holding Silas at gunpoint, his expression grim, his jaw clenched. "Thank you, John," Cass said, his voice sincere. "You saved my life." John nodded, his gaze unwavering.
"We're not out of this yet," he said.
"We still have to deal with Blackwood." Silas was kneeling on the ground, his wounded shoulder bleeding profusely, his face contorted with pain and hatred. He glared at John, his eyes filled with venom. "You'll pay for this, whoever you are," he snarled. "My employer, he won't let this go unpunished." "Your employer can go to hell," John retorted, his voice cold. "And you can join him." He turned to Cass. "Who is he, Cass?" he asked. "Who hired Blackwood to kill you?" Cass hesitated, his gaze flickering towards Belle, his expression filled with a mixture of shame and regret. He knew he couldn't keep the truth hidden any longer, that the time had come to reveal the secrets of his past, the sins he had committed, the debts he still owed. "His name is Alistair Thorne," Cass said, his voice low and heavy. "He was my former partner. In business and in life." Belle gasped, her eyes widening in shock. She had suspected a connection, a past relationship, but she hadn't imagined this. "He was Sarah's fiancé," Cass continued, his voice trembling with emotion. "The man who murdered her. The man I betrayed." He explained the story, the complicated, tragic tale of his past. He told them about his life in the East, his wealthy family, his partnership with Alistair Thorne, his love affair with Sarah, his discovery of Thorne's criminal activities, his decision to expose him, his escape west, his transformation into Cass Rhodes, the gambler, the outlaw. He told them about Thorne's relentless pursuit, his desire for revenge, his determination to make Cass pay for his betrayal. He told them about the debt he owed, not just to Thorne, but to Sarah, to her memory, to the life they had planned together. Belle listened, her heart aching for him, her mind reeling from the revelations. She understood now. The depth of his pain, the source of his darkness, the reasons for his choices. John listened, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and understanding. He had judged Cass harshly, he realized, without knowing the full story, without understanding the burdens he carried. When Cass had finished, a silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the sound of Silas's ragged breathing and the distant cry of a hawk. John lowered his rifle, his gaze softening. "We'll take Blackwood back to town," he said, "and we'll turn him over to the sheriff." He turned to look at Cass, with a newfound understanding. And then he continued, "We'll deal with Thorne. Together." Cass nodded, his eyes meeting John's, his expression filled with gratitude and hope. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, a difficult journey to redemption, but he also knew he wasn't alone. He had Belle. He had John. He had a chance to make things right, to atone for his past, to build a future free from the shadows of his former life. They bound Silas's wound, hoisted him onto one of the horses, and began the long journey back to Dust Evil Gulch. The setting was somber, surrounded as they were by the canyon's walls tall, imposing structures standing like ruins of broken vows and old betrayals. Yet, within that desolation, a new alliance had been forged, a bond of trust and shared purpose, born out of a desperate situation, a shared love for a woman, and a mutual desire for justice. The weight of the past was still present, heavy on their shoulders, but it no longer felt insurmountable. It felt manageable. Together, they could face it. Together, they could overcome it. Chapter 15. The Ghosts of Promises Unkept. The return to Dust Devil Gulch was tense and fraught with unspoken anxieties. Silas Blackwood, bound and sullen, rode between John and Cass, his wounded shoulder a constant reminder of the violence that had transpired. Belle rode beside Cass, her hand occasionally reaching out to touch his arm, a silent reassurance of her presence, her support, her unwavering love. The townspeople, seeing the unlikely quartet approach, stared in open-mouthed surprise. Rumors of Cass's abduction had spread like wildfire, fueled by speculation and fear. The sight of him, alive and seemingly unharmed, alongside John, his former rival, and Silas Blackwood, a notorious outlaw, was a spectacle that defied explanation. They rode directly to the sheriff's office, the small, dilapidated building a symbol of the town's corrupt and ineffectual law enforcement. Sheriff Hogan, startled by their arrival, emerged from his office, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and apprehension. "What in tarnation?" he stammered, his gaze darting between Cass, John, and Silas. "What's going on here?" John dismounted, his movements swift and decisive. He pulled Silas from his horse, shoving him roughly towards the sheriff. "This man, Silas Blackwood, attempted to murder Cass Rhodes," John said, his voice cold and hard. "He was hired by Alistair Thorne. I want him locked up, Hogan. And I want you to send a telegram to the nearest federal marshal. This is bigger than you can handle." Sheriff Hogan, clearly intimidated by John's demeanor and the gravity of the situation, stammered his agreement. He fumbled with his keys, unlocking the cell door and shoving Silas inside. "I'll do as you say," he said, his voice trembling. "I'll send the telegram right away." John turned to Cass, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "We need to talk, Cass," he said. "About Thorne. About what we're going to do." Cass nodded, his gaze meeting John's, his expression grim. He knew this was just the beginning, that the confrontation with Alistair Thorne was inevitable, that the ghosts of his past were about to resurface, threatening to destroy everything he'd built, everything he loved. They left the sheriff's office, the three of them, walking towards the Lucky Star Saloon. The townspeople watched them, their faces filled with curiosity and speculation, their whispers following them like shadows. As they reached the saloon, Belle noticed a figure standing in the shadows across the street. A woman, tall and elegant, dressed in a fine traveling suit, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. There was something familiar about her, something that made Belle's heart skip a beat. The woman stepped forward, into the light, and Belle gasped. It was Sarah. But that was impossible. Sarah was dead. Cass had told them. He'd received a letter informing him of her murder. Belle looked at Cass, her eyes wide with confusion and disbelief. He was staring at the woman, his face ashen, his body trembling, his expression a mixture of shock, disbelief, and hope. "Sarah?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Is it really you?" The woman smiled, a sad, wistful smile that tugged at Belle's heart. "Yes, Cass," she said, her voice soft and melodious. "It's me." She approached him, her step slow and deliberate, her eyes filled with a mixture of love, longing, and regret. Cass reached out, his hand trembling, his fingers gently touching her face, as if to assure himself that she was real, that she wasn't a ghost, a figment of his imagination.
But how? He stammered.
I thought you were dead. Sarah's smile faded, her eyes filling with tears. I was supposed to be, she said. Alistair, he staged my death. To keep us apart. To punish me for loving you. She explained the story, the elaborate deception, the lies, the manipulations. She told them how Alistair had forced her to write the letter, how he had threatened to kill her family if she didn't comply, how he had kept her prisoner for years, moving her from place to place, keeping her isolated, keeping her from Cass. She told them how she had finally escaped, how she had tracked Cass to Dust Devil Gulch, how she had been watching him, waiting for the right moment to reveal herself. Belle listened, her heart aching for both Sarah and Cass, her mind reeling from the revelations. She felt a surge of relief that Sarah was alive, that Cass hadn't been living a lie, that the love they had shared was real, was enduring. But she also felt a pang of jealousy. A fear that Sarah's return would change everything, that Cass would no longer need her, that their love, their partnership, their future together, would be shattered. She watched the reunion, the raw emotion, the bittersweet joy. It was a scene from a dream, a resurrection of a love believed lost. But for Belle, it felt like the intrusion of a ghost, a specter from a past that threatened to erase her own carefully constructed present. The ghosts of promises unkept were not just Cass's anymore, they were hers, too. The question was, whose promises would endure? Chapter 16. A reckoning born of dust and fire. The reunion between Cass and Sarah was a whirlwind of emotions, disbelief, joy, sorrow, and a lingering undercurrent of fear. They clung to each other, their embrace a testament to the years of separation, the pain they had endured, the love that had somehow survived. Belle stood apart, watching them, her heart a conflicting mix of relief, empathy, and a growing sense of unease. She was happy for Cass. Truly she was. He deserved to be reunited with the woman he loved, the woman he had believed dead for so long. But she couldn't deny the fear that gnawed at her, the fear that Sarah's return would mean the end of her relationship with Cass, the end of the future they had so tentatively planned. John, sensing Belle's distress, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. It'll be all right, Belle, he said softly. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Belle smiled weakly, her eyes filled with gratitude. She appreciated John's support, his friendship, his unwavering loyalty. But she knew this was something she had to face alone, a decision she had to make, a path she had to choose. After the initial shock of the reunion had subsided, Sarah turned her attention to Belle, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. You're Belle, she said, her voice soft and gentle.
Cass has told me about you.
About how you helped him, how you saved him. Belle nodded, her heart pounding in her chest.
And you're Sarah, she said.
The woman he loves. Sarah's expression softened, her eyes filled with a hint of sadness. The woman he loved, she corrected.
Things are different now, Belle.
We've both changed. We've both moved on. Belle's heart skipped a beat. Was Sarah relinquishing her claim on Cass? Was she giving Belle her blessing? Or was she simply acknowledging the reality of the situation, the years of separation, the changes they had both undergone? Before Belle could respond, a shout rang out from across the street. Sarah, you traitorous bitch. It was Alistair Thorne. He stood there, his face contorted with rage, his eyes blazing with hatred, a gun in his hand. He was flanked by several men, all armed and dangerous, their faces grim and menacing. Cass stepped in front of Sarah, shielding her with his body, his own hand hovering over the gun at his hip. Alistair, he said, his voice calm but firm. This ends here.
Now.
Alistair laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. It ends when I say it ends, Rhodes, he snarled. And it ends with you dead. And with Sarah back where she belongs. By my side. He raised his gun, aiming it at Cass. Belle gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She couldn't let him hurt Cass. She couldn't let him destroy the fragile hope that had blossomed between them.
No.
she cried, stepping forward, her voice filled with desperation. Don't do it, Alistair.
Please.
It's over. Let it go. Alistair turned his gaze to Belle, his eyes narrowing, his expression filled with disdain. And who are you? He sneered. Another one of his whores? Another fool who's fallen for his lies? She's his partner, Sarah interjected, her voice strong and clear. And she's a good woman. A brave woman. Unlike you, Alistair. You're a coward. A bully. A murderer. Alistair's face flushed with rage. He turned his gun towards Sarah, his finger tightening on the trigger. Shut your mouth, Sarah, he roared.
Or I'll shut it for you. Permanently.
Before anyone could react, a shot rang out. But it wasn't Alistair's gun. It was John's. John had moved swiftly, silently, positioning himself behind Alistair's men, his rifle aimed and ready. He fired, the bullet striking Alistair in the arm, sending his gun flying. Alistair cried out in pain, clutching his wounded arm, his eyes filled with shock and disbelief. His men, momentarily stunned, hesitated, unsure of what to do. Drop your weapons, John shouted, his voice booming through the street.
Now.
Or the next one will be lethal. Alistair's men, seeing that they were outgunned and outmaneuvered, slowly lowered their weapons, their faces filled with fear and resignation. The confrontation was over. Alistair Thorne, the man who had haunted Cass's past, the man who had threatened to destroy his future, was defeated. The reckoning had come, born of dust and fire, a culmination of years of secrets, lies, and betrayals. The streets of Dust Devil Gulch, once again, bore witness to a showdown, but this time, it was not just about revenge. It was about justice, about redemption, about the possibility of a new beginning. But even as the dust settled, a new uncertainty loomed. What would become of Cass and Sarah? Of Cass and Belle? The external threat was neutralized, but the internal conflicts, the tangled web of love and loyalty, remained. The true reckoning, Belle knew, was yet to come. Chapter 17. The Clasp of Hands, the Clash of Hearts. With Alistair Thorne disarmed and his men subdued, the immediate danger had passed. Sheriff Hogan, emboldened by John's decisive action and the presence of numerous witnesses, finally took charge, arresting Alistair and his henchmen. The townspeople, who had watched the confrontation unfold with a mixture of fear and fascination, erupted in cheers, their relief palpable. But amidst the general celebration, a quiet drama was unfolding between Cass, Sarah, and Belle. The three of them stood together, near the entrance to the Lucky Star, their faces etched with a mixture of emotions: relief, gratitude, uncertainty, and a lingering sense of unease. Cass, his arm around Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and concern, turned to Belle. Belle, he said, his voice soft and earnest. I don't know what to say.
You saved my life.
Again. You and John. Belle smiled weakly, her heart aching with a conflicting mix of emotions. We did what we had to do, Cass, she said. We're partners, remember? Sarah, her gaze shifting between Cass and Belle, stepped forward. Belle, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I owe you an apology. And my gratitude. You've been incredibly brave, incredibly kind. To both of us. Belle nodded, her eyes meeting Sarah's. You don't owe me anything, Sarah, she said. You've been through so much. You deserve to be happy. A silence fell between them. A heavy silence filled with unspoken questions, unresolved feelings, and the daunting prospect of navigating a complex and uncertain future. Cass, sensing the tension, broke the silence. We need to talk, he said, his gaze shifting between Sarah and Belle. The three of us. We need to figure out what happens now. They went inside the Lucky Star, the saloon now empty and quiet. The remnants of the earlier celebration, overturned chairs, spilled drinks, a stark reminder of the violence that had transpired. They sat at a table, the three of them, their faces illuminated by the flickering lamplight. Cass began, his voice hesitant, his eyes filled with a mixture of love, regret, and uncertainty. Sarah, he said, I never stopped loving you. I never stopped dreaming of you. I thought you were dead. I grieved for you. Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. And I never stopped loving you, Cass, she said. Even when I was forced to betray you, even when I was held captive by Alistair, I never stopped hoping that someday, somehow, we would be reunited. Belle listened, her heart aching for them both, her mind struggling to reconcile the past with the present, the love that Cass had shared with Sarah with the love that he had professed for her. But things have changed, Cass, Sarah continued, her voice trembling slightly. We've both changed. We've both lived different lives. We've both found new connections. She looked at Belle, her eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and resignation. You love him, don't you, Belle? She asked softly. Belle hesitated, her gaze meeting Cass's, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to be honest, to be true to herself, to be true to them both. Yes, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I do. Cass's eyes widened slightly, his expression a mixture of surprise and relief. He hadn't known for sure, he hadn't dared to hope until this moment. Sarah nodded, her smile sad but accepting. And he loves you, Belle, she said. I can see it in his eyes. I can feel it in his touch. She turned to Cass, her hand gently cupping his face. Cass, she said, her voice filled with love and sorrow. I will always cherish the memories we shared, the love we had. But I can't go back. I can't pretend that the past didn't happen, that the years of separation didn't change us. She looked at Belle, her eyes filled with a genuine warmth. You've given him something I couldn't, Belle, she said. You've given him hope. You've given him a new life. You've given him a reason to be better. She stood up, her movements graceful and dignified. I'm leaving, Cass, she said. I'm going back east. To start over. To build a new life for myself. A life free from Alistair, free from the shadows of the past. Cass stared at her, his face ashen, his eyes filled with disbelief and pain. He had dreamed of this moment, of being reunited with Sarah for so long. But now that it had arrived, it wasn't what he expected. It wasn't what he wanted. Sarah, please, he said, his voice trembling. Don't go.
Stay.
We can figure this out. Together. Sarah shook her head, her eyes filled with tears.
No, Cass, she said softly.
We can't. It's over. It has to be. She leaned down, kissing him gently on the cheek. Goodbye, Cass, she whispered. I will always love you. But I need to let you go. She turned and walked away, her steps slow but determined, her figure disappearing into the darkness outside. Cass watched her go, his body slumped, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. He had lost her again. But this time it was different. This time it was by choice. Her choice. And, in a way, his own. Belle approached him, her hand gently touching his arm.
Cass, she said softly. I'm so sorry.
Cass turned to her, his eyes filled with tears. He reached out, his arms wrapping around her, his body trembling against hers. He buried his face in her hair, his sobs muffled against her shoulder. Belle held him, her arms embracing him, her heart aching for him, her love for him unwavering. She knew this was a moment of profound loss, of grief, of letting go. But it was also a moment of clarity, of truth, of choosing a new path, a new future. The clasp of hands, once a symbol of reunion, had become a symbol of farewell. And the clash of hearts, the conflicting emotions of love, loss, and loyalty, had finally found a resolution. It was a bittersweet ending, a painful but necessary separation, a paving of the way for a new beginning. The future was still uncertain, but it was, at last, theirs to shape. Chapter 18. Where the wildflowers bloom no more. The days following Sarah's departure were a blur of activity and emotional readjustment. Cass, though heartbroken by her decision, threw himself into work, focusing on the lucky star, on making it a success, on building a future with Belle. He was determined to honor Sarah's sacrifice, to prove that he was worthy of Belle's love, to create a life that was free from the shadows of his past. Belle, in turn, supported him wholeheartedly, her love for him unwavering, her faith in him unshaken. She worked alongside him, her presence a constant source of comfort, of strength, of reassurance. She helped him navigate the complex emotions he was experiencing, the grief, the guilt, the lingering sense of loss, and the burgeoning hope for a new beginning. John, too, remained a steadfast presence, his friendship with both Cass and Belle solidifying in the aftermath of the confrontation with Alistair Thorne. He had proven his loyalty, his courage, his willingness to stand by them, no matter what. He became a trusted confidant, a valuable ally, a silent guardian of their fragile happiness. The town of Dust Devil Gulch, having witnessed the dramatic events of the past few weeks, began to view Cass and Belle in a new light. They were no longer simply the gambler and his indebted employee, they were heroes, saviors, symbols of hope and change. The Lucky Star, once a den of iniquity, became a gathering place, a center of community, a testament to the transformative power of love and redemption. But amidst the positive changes, a lingering sadness remained. The memory of Sarah, her sacrifice, her bittersweet farewell, hung over them like a gentle, melancholic cloud. Cass, though committed to Belle, couldn't entirely erase the love he had felt for Sarah, the years they had shared, the dreams they had once held. One day, a letter arrived for Cass, postmarked from back east. It was from Sarah's brother, the man who had delivered the false news of her death years ago. Belle watched as Cass opened the letter, his hands trembling slightly, his face etched with a mixture of apprehension and hope. He read the letter silently, his expression shifting from shock to disbelief to a profound, overwhelming sadness. He handed the letter to Belle, his eyes filled with tears. Belle read the letter, her heart aching for Cass, for Sarah, for the tragic circumstances that had shaped their lives. The letter informed Cass that Sarah had passed away. She had contracted a fever shortly after arriving back east, and her weakened constitution, a result of years of captivity and mistreatment, had been unable to fight it off. Cass was devastated. He had lost Sarah not once, but twice. And this time it was final. There would be no more reunions, no more second chances, no more possibilities of a future together. Belle held him, her arms wrapping around him, her body offering him solace, her love offering him a lifeline in a sea of grief. She knew there were no words that could truly ease his pain, no actions that could fill the void in his heart. But she could be there for him, unwavering, steadfast, a constant presence in a world that had suddenly shifted on its axis. They decided to hold a small, private memorial service for Sarah, in the canyon where John had been healed, where wildflowers once bloomed in abundance. It was a simple ceremony, attended only by Cass, Belle, John, and Martha. Cass spoke of Sarah, of her beauty, her kindness, her strength, her unwavering love. He spoke of his regrets, his guilt, his sorrow, but also of his gratitude for having known her, for having loved her, for having been loved by her. Belle spoke of Sarah's courage, her resilience, her sacrifice, her willingness to let go of the past and embrace a new future, even if it was a future without Cass. John spoke of Sarah's spirit, her enduring presence, her legacy of love and forgiveness. Martha, her eyes filled with wisdom and compassion, spoke of the healing power of nature, of the cyclical nature of life and death, of the enduring beauty of the desert, even in the face of loss. They placed a small, wooden cross at the base of a towering mesa, a marker of Sarah's passing, a symbol of her enduring spirit. They scattered wildflower seeds, a promise of renewal, of rebirth, of a future where beauty could still bloom, even in the most desolate of places. But the wildflowers, Belle knew, would never truly bloom there again, not in the same way. Sarah's absence had left a void, a barrenness, that could never be fully filled. The canyon, once a place of healing and hope, was now also a place of remembrance, of loss, of the ghosts of promises unkept. It was a somber moment, heavy with grief, yet tinged with a sense of closure. A chapter had ended, definitively, and a new one, still unwritten, was about to begin. Life, with its unpredictable turns and its capacity for both immense joy and profound sorrow, continued. Chapter 19. The Final Gamble of Fate and Faith. Life in Dust Devil Gulch settled into a new rhythm after Sarah's memorial. The town, freed from the grip of Alastair Thorne's corruption, began to flourish. The Lucky Star, under Cass and Belle's stewardship, became a thriving hub of honest business and community gatherings. Cass, though still carrying the weight of his past, channeled his grief into positive action, determined to build a better future, a legacy that would honor Sarah's memory and Belle's unwavering faith in him. Belle, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just Cass's partner in business, she was his partner in life, his confidant, his love, his anchor in a world that had often felt turbulent and uncertain. She embraced her role, not just as a saloon owner, but as a leader in the community, a voice for the voiceless, a champion of justice and fairness. John, ever the steadfast friend, remained a constant presence in their lives. He had found work as a ranch hand on a nearby spread, his skills with horses and his quiet strength earning him the respect of his fellow cowboys. He visited the Lucky Star often, sharing meals with Cass and Belle, offering his support, his wisdom, his unwavering friendship. One evening, as Cass and Belle were closing up the saloon, a lone rider approached. He was a stranger, dressed in the garb of a federal marshal, his face weathered and stern, his eyes sharp and observant. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, and approached the entrance to the Lucky Star. Cass, sensing trouble, instinctively moved in front of Belle, his hand hovering over the gun he now always carried. "Can I help you, Marshal?" Cass asked, his voice calm but cautious. The Marshal nodded, his gaze sweeping over Cass and Belle. "I'm looking for Cass Rhodes," he said, his voice firm and authoritative. "And Belle Carter." "We are they," Cass replied, his jaw clenched. "What's this about?" The Marshal reached into his coat, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "I have a warrant," he said, "for the arrest of Cass Rhodes." Belle gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Arrest? For what?" The Marshal unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the document. "For crimes committed in the state of New York," he said. "Fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder." Cass's face paled, his body tensing. He had known this day might come, that his past might eventually catch up with him. But he hadn't expected it, not now, not when he had finally found a measure of peace, of happiness, of redemption. "Those are old charges," Cass said, his voice trembling slightly. "Fabricated by Alastair Thorne."
"To ruin me."
"That may be," the Marshal said, his expression unmoved. "But I have a duty to uphold the law. I have orders to take you into custody, Mr. Rhodes, and to transport you back east to stand trial." Belle stepped forward, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You can't take him," she said. "He's innocent. He's changed. He's built a new life here." The Marshal's gaze softened slightly, his eyes meeting Belle's. "I understand your loyalty, ma'am," he said. "But the law is the law. I have to do my job." Cass placed a comforting hand on Belle's arm. "It's all right, Belle," he said softly. "I'll go with him. I'll face these charges. I'll prove my innocence." He turned to the Marshal, his expression resolute. "I'm ready," he said. Belle watched, her heart breaking, as the Marshal handcuffed Cass, his movements practiced and efficient. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to stop them, but she knew it was futile. Cass had to face his past. He had to confront the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. John, who had been standing nearby, witnessing the scene unfold, stepped forward. "I'm going with you, Cass," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "As a witness. As a friend." Cass smiled gratefully, his eyes meeting John's. "Thank you, John," he said. "I appreciate that." The Marshal nodded, his expression grudgingly respectful. "You can ride along, Mr. John," he said. "But you'll have no say in the proceedings. You're there as an observer, nothing more." As they prepared to depart, Belle rushed to Cass, her arms wrapping around him, her tears falling onto his shoulder. "I love you, Cass," she whispered. "I'll wait for you. No matter how long it takes. I'll be here." Cass held her close, his own eyes filled with tears. "And I love you, Belle," he said. "More than anything. I'll come back to you. I promise." He kissed her, a long, passionate kiss that spoke volumes about their love, their commitment, their unwavering faith in each other. It was a kiss of goodbye, but also a kiss of hope, a promise of a future together, a future they would fight for, no matter the odds. It was the final gamble, a gamble of fate and faith, a test of their love, their resilience, their ability to overcome the obstacles that life had thrown in their path. The outcome was uncertain. The journey ahead would be long and arduous, but their love, their bond, their shared belief in a better future would sustain them. As they rode away, Belle stood and watched. It was a gamble, perhaps the biggest either of them would make. But this time, it wasn't about cards or money. It was about something far more precious. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The journey back east was long and arduous, filled with sleepless nights, uncomfortable travel, and the constant weight of uncertainty. Cass, though treated fairly by the marshal, remained a prisoner, his freedom curtailed, his future hanging in the balance. John, his steadfast companion, offered what comfort he could, sharing stories, playing cards, and reminding Cass of Belle's unwavering love and support. Upon reaching New York, Cass was immediately incarcerated, awaiting trial. The legal proceedings were complex and protracted, a labyrinth of legal maneuvering, conflicting testimonies, and the ever-present shadow of Alistair Thorne's influence, even from behind bars. Thorne, it turned out, still had powerful allies, men who were willing to perjure themselves, to fabricate evidence, to do anything to ensure Cass's conviction. John, true to his word, remained by Cass's side, attending every court session, offering moral support, and working tirelessly behind the scenes to gather evidence, to find witnesses who could testify to Cass's innocence, to expose Thorne's lies. Meanwhile, back in Dust Devil Gulch, Belle ran the Lucky Star, her heart heavy with worry, her days filled with a constant longing for Cass. She received letters from him regularly, letters filled with love, with hope, with determination, but also with a growing sense of frustration and despair at the seemingly insurmountable obstacles he faced. She also received letters from John, updating her on the progress of the trial, on the challenges they faced, on the small victories they achieved. John's letters were less flowery than Cass's, but they were filled with a steadfast loyalty, a quiet determination, and a genuine affection for both Cass and Belle. As the trial dragged on, Belle decided she could no longer remain idle. She had to do something to help Cass, to fight for their future. She sold her share of the Lucky Star to a trusted associate, packed her bags, and boarded a train bound for New York. Her arrival in the bustling city was a shock to the system. The noise, the crowds, the sheer scale of the metropolis were overwhelming, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of the desert. But Belle was undeterred. She was a woman on a mission, a woman driven by love, by loyalty, by a fierce determination to see justice done. She found Cass and John in a small, dimly lit boarding house near the courthouse. The reunion was emotional, filled with tears, with embraces, with a renewed sense of hope. Cass, his face gaunt and weary, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and relief, held her close, his voice trembling with emotion. "Belle," he whispered, "you came. You shouldn't have. It's too dangerous." Belle smiled, her eyes meeting his. "I had to, Cass," she said. "I couldn't stay away. I had to be with you, to fight for you." John, standing nearby, smiled warmly, his eyes filled with admiration. "You're a force to be reckoned with, Belle Carter," he said. "A true partner." Belle's presence in New York proved to be a turning point in the trial. She was a compelling witness, her testimony clear, concise, and filled with a genuine conviction that swayed the jury. She spoke of Cass's transformation, of his efforts to build a new life, of his commitment to justice and fairness. She spoke of his love for Sarah, of his grief at her loss, of his unwavering determination to honor her memory. She also, unexpectedly, produced a key piece of evidence. It was a letter written by Alastair Thorne to Sarah years ago while she was being held captive. The letter, which Sarah had hidden and which Belle had found among Sarah's belongings after her death, contained a detailed confession of Thorne's crimes, including the murder of Sarah's father, the framing of Cass, and the conspiracy to murder Cass. The letter was a bombshell, a damning piece of evidence that shattered Thorne's defense and exposed his lies. The jury, after a brief deliberation, returned a verdict of not guilty. Cass was free. The courtroom erupted in cheers, a wave of relief and jubilation washing over Cass, Belle, and John. Cass and Belle embraced, their tears mingling, their hearts overflowing with joy and gratitude. John, his eyes filled with tears of his own, clapped Cass on the back, his smile wide and genuine. It had all come to this, a final confrontation, not of guns, but of hearts and horizons. The courtroom, a sterile and imposing space, had become the unlikely setting for the ultimate resolution of their intertwined stories. Past debts were paid, not with money or blood, but with truth and forgiveness. The horizon, once clouded by uncertainty and fear, now stretched out before them, clear and bright, filled with the promise of a new beginning. They had gambled everything, their love, their freedom, their very lives, and they had won. Epilogue. The train ride back to Dust Devil Gulch was a stark contrast to Cass's previous journey east. This time, he was a free man, vindicated, his name cleared, his future stretching out before him, filled with possibilities. Beside him sat Belle, her hand clasped in his, her presence a constant source of comfort, of strength, of unwavering love. John, seated across from them, dozed peacefully, his role as guardian and friend fulfilled. The landscape, once viewed through the bars of a prisoner's transport, now seemed vibrant and welcoming. The vast expanse of the desert, the towering mesas, the endless sky, all spoke of freedom, of opportunity, of a new beginning. They arrived in Dust Devil Gulch to a hero's welcome. The townspeople, overjoyed at Cass's return and Belle's triumphant role in securing his freedom, lined the streets, cheering, waving, their faces beaming with joy and relief. The Lucky Star, now under new management, but still bearing its iconic name, was festooned with banners and flowers, a testament to the enduring spirit of the community and the transformative power of love and redemption. Cass and Belle, hand in hand, stepped off the train, their hearts overflowing with gratitude. They had faced adversity, they had overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, they had fought for their love, for their future, and they had won. They built a life together in Dust Devil Gulch, a life filled with love, with laughter, with purpose. They became pillars of the community, their names synonymous with justice, with fairness, with compassion. The Lucky Star, a symbol of their resilience and their commitment to a better future, continued to thrive, a gathering place for friends, neighbors, and travelers alike. John remained a close friend, a trusted confidant, a silent guardian of their happiness. He eventually found love of his own, marrying a local woman, a kind and gentle soul who appreciated his quiet strength and his unwavering loyalty. Cass and Belle never forgot Sarah. They visited her memorial in the canyon often, placing fresh wildflowers on her grave, remembering her sacrifice, honoring her memory. They spoke of her often, keeping her spirit alive in their hearts, acknowledging the role she had played in shaping their lives, in bringing them together. Years passed, seasons changed, and the desert landscape weathered and transformed, just as they did. Cass and Belle grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year, their bond unbreakable, their commitment unwavering. They faced new challenges, new joys, new sorrows, but they faced them together, hand in hand, their hearts intertwined, their spirits united. One evening, as the sun set over the vast expanse of the desert, painting the sky with fiery hues of orange and red. Cass and Belle sat on the porch of their small ranch house, their hands clasped, their eyes fixed on the horizon. "We made it, Belle," Cass said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of contentment and wonder. "We actually made it." Belle smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners, her face etched with the lines of a life well lived, a love well cherished. "Yes, Cass," she said.
"We did."
"We played the hand we were dealt, and we won." They sat in silence, their hearts filled with gratitude, their spirits at peace. The desert wind whispered through the dry grasses, carrying the echoes of their past, the whispers of their love, the promise of their enduring legacy. The stars, bright and countless, twinkled in the darkening sky, witnesses to their journey, their triumph, their unwavering faith in each other and in the enduring power of love. The vast, open horizon stretched out before them, a symbol of the endless possibilities that life, even in its twilight, still held. The end.